Credit where it's due, I had an absolute blast with the Mafia Definitive Edition remake of the original Mafia, which came out back in 2002. This remake is obviously a massive improvement over the 2002 original, looking vastly improved, obviously, because it has modern graphics for one, but I'd be reluctant to refer to playing this game as smooth sailing. Despite the fact that the game's remade from the ground up with new graphics, gameplay, and a little bit more fleshed out story with new voice acting, I'm finding it a little bit tough to understand who this game is actually meant for. Is it meant for people who played Mafia back in 2002 to get an updated experience, being in keeping as possible for the sake of fan service, or is it meant for new players to draw them to this story by fleshing it out and making it feel more modern in its telling? Like I said, I really enjoyed this game, but I'm a little bit confused as to why it had to exist to begin with. Regardless of its intent, this still turned out to be a solid game, so here's my sort of review of Mafia Definitive Edition. A solid remake, I guess. I'd like to begin by saying that this video is a little bit later than I would have liked. This game initially dropped on the 25th of September 2020. I was away and I only got back on the 29th, at which point I was able to play this game, and then it took me a few days to finish, as I did it on stream. On which I streamed it, but I didn't record it, so for the most part I've got to make do with footage of the archives of those streams, as well as a bit of footage I recorded in free play. So if at any point this video doesn't look as crisp as it could have been, I sincerely apologise, but I didn't want to invest another 7 or 8 hours replaying the entire game for the sake of recording footage for a video that isn't that high on my priority list when I've got bigger projects in the works. So let's start by listing the positive, talking about what this game does right, and there's a lot that this game does for itself. First things first, there's an 18-year time difference between the release of the remake and the release of the original game, so as you could expect, the graphics have been madly improved. And we all know how far graphical technology in gaming has come in 18 years, so the comparison of the original game versus the remake kind of speaks for itself. Visually, these are two very, very different games, and in truth, they are different games. One's the original, another's a remake, but you get my point with the graphics. The difference between the two games is the easiest thing to spot. Visually, Mafia Definitive Edition looks great, thriving especially at nighttime with how the lighting hits everything. It's just beautiful. I know this is really specific, but car headlights are gorgeous. The faces at times can look a little bit weird, a little bit soft if you know what I mean, but for the most part this game looks really solid. I wouldn't call it the most graphically impressive game of the generation, but I don't need it to be because that's not what it tried to be. It is worth bearing in mind that I played this game on PC. It may not look as strong on console, but I don't know, I didn't play it on console. The last thing that we need to talk about in depth is something that you can all see for yourselves, so we're going to move on quickly to the next point. Gameplay is pretty solid as well. You have your mixture of your stealth, you have shootouts, then you've got fist fights which are pretty fun, and then you have driving. There's a lot of driving in this game, and sometimes it behaves, other times not so much. It can be a right laugh either way, but when you really need it to behave and it just doesn't, it can be a pain in the arse. In the settings, you can change it between game-ish and then simulated to be a little bit more realistic, and you can also change it between manual and automatic transmissions, so you have to shift the gears yourself in manual, and the option to have that is always quite nice. I can't compare the gameplay myself to the gameplay of the original Mafia, as my experience with that game is very limited, but based on what I've seen, it has been modernised. Obviously. It's worth remembering that that doesn't make it the most immersive and amazing gameplay that you'll ever see. In fact, I'd hardly use the word modernised. It doesn't feel new, but it doesn't feel old either. The shootouts at times can feel a little bit weird, but otherwise I don't have too many complaints about that. I do find it a bit weird how, for example, the Tommy gun feels completely useless unless it's being used against you. That's probably an unfair exaggeration based on my own experience, which is probably rooted in my playstyle, which can only be described as impatient. Which is where we get onto one of the positives of the gameplay, which is it requires you to be patient in shootouts and also in chases. You need to take things slowly, not too slowly, but slow enough. If you do things as quickly as possible, you quickly lose control of the game and then don't succeed. It's not in depth to the point where it's clear whether or not it was 100% intentional, but that's how it works out in gameplay. But I will say there are some aspects, such as the race, that just take the piss. The game functions as a linear story set within an open world space, but it isn't really an open world game. There is a free play mode in which you can do a load of tasks for a guy named... I forget what his name was. Herbert Baskerville, that's it. But oddly enough, the free play mode that allows you to explore this open world is a separate game mode accessed from the main menu. And what you can do in that mostly consists of challenges around the map, and there's not really that many of them. And when you're done with them all, which can't take too long, you'll just find yourself in an empty feeling open world with nothing else to do besides from beat up random civilians, and run about aimlessly wearing daft skins, which would be really funny to use in the story mode. My point is, instead of having a separate free play mode, which in itself is fine, it's not really too much to it, but it's fine just the same, why not just integrate it into the main game, into the story mode? Since the game was built from the ground up, surely that couldn't have been too difficult to do. I understand and appreciate the backdrop of Lost Heaven being more of an elaborate set than an actual open world you can play about in, but if that's the case, then why include the free play mode at all? All we can do is drive about, get the police to chase us and kill random people, and do some challenges for a random man named Herbert. And if you think about it, it just doesn't flow quite well to have that be a separate mode accessible from the main menu. Were it integrated with the main story mode so you could go off and do your own thing every now and then, it would have been a little bit nicer. I think they wanted to keep the storytelling structure that they had with the original Mafia 1, and believe me, I do understand that. But when remaking a game, isn't it better to have the attitude of, what if we remade it today? They went from the ground up with everything in this, from the voice cast to how the story actually plays out in a few aspects, changing quite a fair bit and adding a fair bit of depth. You'd have thought that integrating the open world mode into the same experience as the base story would be something that you'd want to do. The game doesn't need to be GTA style by a long stretch. Nope, that's not the kind of game that Mafia tries to be. If they're going to do something like this, they should employ something like what Mafia 2 did. I'd hardly call it a fully realised open world, but there are some things that you can do around. You can go to a diner, you can change your clothes at a clothes shop, you can go to a gun store or refuel at a gas station, and you could do all this while in chapters. I guess the Mafia 1 chapters, they wanted to keep the structure relatively similar, where it sort of keeps its linearity, but this game doesn't seem to have a problem restructuring entire aspects of Mafia 1, so why not go the step further to integrate the open world in the story, instead of have us dash off into a separate game mode that doesn't have much going on for it, so it doesn't sustain itself too well. I would have understood their approach had they wanted to be as in keeping as possible with Mafia 1, however it just doesn't appear to be the case, and while this game does have the skin of a new feeling game, it just doesn't feel new when you play it. Which brings us to a point that I raised at the beginning of the video. I'm not entirely sure who this remake is for. Is it for new players, or is it fan service for old players? It's a solid game regardless, but it doesn't cater to either of these audiences really, and that has an effect on the narrative as well. A lot of things in this game happen just because. There's massive time gap differences between one chapter and another, not necessarily years or whatever, but they don't flow into one another. It just tells you that one chapter's done, and then you pick up later, doing something else entirely, often unrelated, without properly tying up the last chapter fully. I'd get it if they were trying to be as in keeping as possible with Mafia 1, however they restructure entire scenes, so I don't think that's necessarily the case. That doesn't mean the story's bad by a long stretch. I quite enjoy it, the characters are quite damn good as well. I just feel like at times it's a bit all over the place. I didn't, however, come away feeling dissatisfied. If you want a narrative experience that you can enjoy in under 10 hours, this game ain't too bad. Moving on to the technical side of things, I've seen a lot of people complaining about graphical issues with the game, for example pop-ins and stuff like that. On my PC at the very least it wasn't too bad, but there were moments where this would happen. As for other glitches, I had a relatively smooth experience, however most noticeably sometimes characters would just die and freeze in place. But it's safe to say that I didn't encounter bugs to a point where I'd consider it buggy when compared to other games. And so when it does have a little blip, I'm okay to just laugh at it a little bit. Beyond that, nothing really technical comes to mind, however it did conflict with Streamlabs OBS, which I used to stream the games a little bit, but that's nothing to do with the actual game itself, so I shan't hold it against it. I won't sit here and pretend there's a game out there that doesn't have its technical moments of pure specialty, but I don't think, at least not for me, that Mafia Definitive Edition stood out in that aspect, not necessarily above, but beyond any other game. Moving on, the soundtrack that plays in the background of this game, I'm sure I'll use a few examples in the background of this video, is really nice as well, so I have no gripes with that whatsoever. When it comes down to it, the biggest issue with Mafia Definitive Edition is the question, what is this game meant to be? Is it meant to be faithful to Mafia 1, or is it supposed to be a reimagining of that story? At times I feel like it's trying to be both and winds up actually being neither. It's got a lot of good stuff going for it as a game, don't get me wrong, but as a remake remake, it exists purely for the sake of existing. It doesn't feel like a reimagining of anything, nor does it feel really like fan service. From what I've seen, it loosely copies Mafia 1 with some things that carry over, but it doesn't feel like something that's trying to be fan servicey. It's just a game, really. Not a bad one, it's quite a fun one, and it also feels like Mafia, at least how I know and love it with Mafia 2. I will say the ending does tie in a little bit to Mafia 2, and then by extension through to 3. So for the sake of connecting Mafia 1 to the other two games, that's certainly quite a solid change. I won't go into how because I don't wish to spoil it, but it is a satisfying-ish connection. To conclude this video before it gets too long and too rambly, I don't regret playing Mafia Definitive Edition. I had a cracking time with it. I think it's a solid remake, but more so a good game. But I think it would have been a lot better had it figured out whether or not it wanted to be a reimagining of Mafia 1 or a faithful remake. I won't give it a number rating like I used to because I'll explain this every single time if I have to. I don't really feel too connected to a number rating. Like, what's the criteria? Does it have any? No, not really. What could it have been? Nobody knows because it's not at its full potential. And then what am I comparing it to? Because again, I have no clue. So I'll just say, if you want to sink less than 10 hours into a game and feel happy with that, then give Mafia Definitive Edition a go. A game does not have to be incredible in every sense of the word to be enjoyable. And if you have already played it, let me know what you think down in that fat comment section that you'll find below this video. But that's where I shall leave it, so thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff. That would be fantastic. Remember, if you disagree with me, then that's absolutely fine, just please don't plant a bomb under my car, otherwise I'll be dead, and then that won't be very good, will it? Please keep it respectful in the comments. I know that that'll fall on the deaf ears of somebody, but hopefully not, you never know. And with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, take care and goodbye.